Hi everyone, I think we are live. So, hi and welcome to this free live webinar on how to live like Socrates. My name is Donald Robertson. I'm a cognitive behavioural psychotherapist and the author of 6 books on philosophy and psychotherapy, including the forthcoming How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, the Stoic Philosophy of Marcus Aurelius, which is based on another course that I run. And I'm here today, though, to talk about Socrates, particularly some practical things we can learn from his philosophy and from his life. If you want to just say hi in the comments on the right-hand side of YouTube in the player, and let me know if you can hear me okay, that's always useful. So also, just to give you a heads up, if you're interested in learning more, I'll be sharing a special link during this webinar for my brand new course, which is called How to Live Like Socrates. So, I first became interested in Socrates when I was a teenager in Scotland, about 30 years ago now. I tried to read Plato's Republic cover to cover, but I found it quite hard going as an introduction at that age. Luckily, I stumbled across a battered old second-hand book that consisted of excerpts, quotations about Socrates from Plato. That was what I really needed to get started, and I was hooked. Before long, I was reading the Platonic dialogues and getting more and more out of them. Then I went to Aberdeen to study philosophy, and I've been in love with the classics ever since. My main career, though, has been as a psychotherapist and a trainer, and I naturally saw parallels between the ideas of some philosophers and certain modern techniques used in psychotherapy and for self-improvement. I mainly became known for writing and teaching about the relationship between ancient Stoic philosophy and modern cognitive psychotherapy. However, Stoicism is a Socratic philosophy. Socrates is the quintessential Greek philosopher and the granddaddy of Stoicism, if you like. He's also therefore the granddaddy of modern cognitive therapy, which employs its own version of the Socratic method or Socratic questioning. Now, the course I'm running starts on Sunday, and it's divided into 4 main sections that correspond to what are known as the 4 cardinal virtues of Greek philosophy. We first encounter this fourfold model in several of Plato's dialogues, where Socrates and his associates speak about the virtues of wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance. So in this webinar, let's look briefly at some of the more practical topics that fall under those 4 headings. I'll be approaching things from the perspective of cognitive therapy and self-improvement psychology. And I should also say that there are many ambiguities and debates, both about the life and the philosophy of Socrates, and many people will interpret what I'm about to say differently. This is just my way of approaching the subject. So let's begin with the cardinal virtue of wisdom. Socrates places most emphasis on the virtue of wisdom, unsurprisingly. The very word philosophy means love of wisdom in Greek, and he discusses this meaning in Plato's Symposium. One of the techniques that seems most obviously related to the virtue of wisdom is the Socratic method itself. In Plato's Apology, Socrates famously tells the story of how the oracle of Delphi pronounced that no man was wiser than him, no man is wiser than Socrates. He claims that his doubt about his own wisdom motivated him to go around questioning other people who were reputed to be wise. However, he found repeatedly that although some of them had practical knowledge of certain crafts, they all lacked true wisdom with regard to the most important questions in life, the nature of the good and the virtues. Socrates developed his method of questioning from this experience. It's also called the elenchus, or refutation, an allusion to the sort of questioning used to cross-examine a witness in a court of law. We're told that Socrates' aim in questioning others about virtue and related concepts was to purify their minds of arrogance and self-conceit. His method normally requires asking the other person to propose a verbal definition of a virtue. For example, the general Laches says that courage means remaining at your post and not running away when fighting the enemy. Socrates will normally point out contradictions between these definitions and the other beliefs held by his partners in dialogue, often showing that the definition is too narrow or it's too broad and it needs to be revised. In this way, he helps them to clarify their values, although they don't normally arrive at a firm conclusion. However, you can't prove that a belief is true through this sort of method of exposing contradictions. You can only prove that it's incoherent, contradictory, which implies that it's false. There's been endless scholarly debate about the nature of the Socratic method throughout the centuries. Different people interpret it differently. However, as a therapist, what interests me is that Socrates called it a therapy, or therapeia in Greek. Although it can't prove that a philosophical belief is true, it can purify our minds of intellectual and moral conceit by showing us that some of the beliefs we take for granted are flawed or contradictory. Socrates compares himself to a physician in this regard, helping his young students to become more open-minded and to purge their minds of the arrogance that consists in the mistaken belief that they know something when they do not. That's why, in his defence speech, Socrates said that although he lacked wisdom himself, he believed that in one small way he was slightly wiser, a wee bit wiser than the experts, the sophists and politicians and poets that he went around questioning. They arrogantly believed that they possessed great wisdom about subjects like moral virtue, but under cross-examination it became obvious that their beliefs were contradictory and incoherent. Socrates, however, knew that he was ignorant about these things, and in this sense, he says, his little bit of real wisdom consisted. In that humble regard, he was indeed wiser than other men, as the oracle of Apollo had stated. So what about the other virtues? Let's take justice next. Justice is the main topic of Plato's magnum opus, the Republic, which consists of a mammoth 10 books of dialogue. Ancient commentators accused Plato of using Socrates as a mouthpiece for his own opinions, or those derived from other philosophers. So throughout the centuries, scholars have struggled to separate the real Socrates from Plato's Socrates. However, it's generally believed that Plato's earlier dialogues paint a more authentic picture of Socrates, whereas his later ones include more of his own ideas. Now, the Republic is usually seen as containing many views that seem unlikely to have been held by Socrates. However, it's often observed that Book 1 out of the 10 appears very different in style from what follows and resembles the other early Platonic dialogues, if it's perhaps one of them. So maybe that's the real Socrates. So what does Socrates actually say there in Book 1 of the Republic? When asked to define justice, his young friend Polemarchus says that justice means helping our friends and harming our enemies. This was a well-known traditional Greek concept of justice, so it's an answer Socrates would have heard many times before. People still think the same way today though. Here's an example. In 1971, President Nixon was tape recorded saying the following about the appointment of a new IRS commissioner. He said, "I want to be sure he's a ruthless son of a bitch, that he will do what he's told, that every income tax return I want to see, I see, and that he will go after our enemies and not go after our friends." That's Nixon on tape. Help our friends, harm our enemies. That's certainly one view of morality. Socrates said this was wrong though, or rather he said it leaves us in moral contradictions. I don't have time now to reproduce his whole argument, but one of his questions is, can the just, by justice, make men unjust? Socrates says, no. We can't say that someone is acting justly if their intention is to do harm and they realise that doing so will create injustice. An eye for an eye will leave the whole world blind, as the saying goes. We can't claim to be good if we're knowingly making other people bad. We can't be serving justice if we're creating more criminals. Instead, Socrates seems to have in mind the paradoxical view that justice consists in both helping our friends and helping our enemies. That wouldn't mean giving them money or property though, but helping them acquire what Socrates saw as the highest goods, wisdom and virtue. We help both our friends and our enemies if we can educate them. Socrates' radical challenging of age-old concepts of justice is tied up with the enormous value he placed on friendship. He used to joke that he thought it was weird how a shepherd would be able to tell you how many sheep are in his flock, but most people can't tell you how many real friends they have, even though friends are much more valuable than sheep. People don't count their friends. They don't think about it. They don't evaluate it very often. They're not clear about it. From a psychological point of view, we can see that an important consequence of Socrates' views about justice would be that they undermine much of the rationale for anger. Socrates himself was famous for his lack of anger. He put up with a lot of abuse without ever getting fazed, and the Stoics particularly admired his ability to defuse arguments. One of the sayings attributed to Socrates is that it takes two to make a quarrel. What about the next virtue? Temperance. To ancient Greeks, this meant a combination of modesty and self-control. It's a tricky concept to translate into English, actually. Sophrosune is the Greek. Plato talks about Socrates' reputation for exceptional self-discipline, but the person who really emphasised this side of his character was an Athenian military general called Xenophon, who became a friend and student of Socrates. People often mistakenly assume that Plato is our only source of information about Socrates. However, apart from various other fragments and bits and pieces, we also have many Socratic dialogues written by Xenophon. His memorabilia consists of 4 books of lots of little dialogues featuring Socrates, and also his symposium. Lots of little dialogues by Xenophon featuring Socrates. Xenophon stressed that Socrates exhibited tremendous self-discipline, and that his young students benefited as much from sharing his company and modelling his behaviour as they did from listening to his philosophy. Now, there's a story that a Phoenician merchant called Zeno of Citium was shipwrecked near Athens about 3 generations after Socrates' death. Destitute, penniless, and alone in a foreign city, he found himself at a bookseller's stall, listening by chance to someone reading aloud from the second book of Xenophon's Memorabilia of Socrates. When they finished, Zeno jumped to his feet, having decided to dedicate the rest of his life to the study of philosophy. After training in cynicism and other schools of Socratic philosophy for over 20 years, he later founded the Stoic school. So what on earth was read aloud to him from that book? What could have caused such a dramatic response? Well, it's the Socratic dialogue about the virtue of self-discipline, part of temperance. After a short discussion with one of his students who lacked self-control, Socrates begins telling an allegorical story written by the sophist Prodicus, which has become known as the Choice of Hercules. It's a famous speech or allegory. It was once quite famous, and it's depicted in many Renaissance works of art. The composer Handel wrote a piece of music dedicated to it. What Zeno, the founder of Stoicism, heard was Socrates' version of this incredibly powerful speech, an exhortation aimed at young men, designed to motivate and inspire them to become philosophers and dedicate themselves to a life of self-improvement. In this speech, Socrates says that the goddess Arete, or virtue, taught the Greek hero Hercules that nothing truly good and admirable is granted by the gods to men without some effort and application. Here, as elsewhere, Socrates gives many specific pieces of advice to his young students about self-discipline, self-control, temperance. He said that whereas others lived to eat, he ate to live. He said that the best sauce with which to serve our food is hunger. He believed that wine and fine cooking stimulate our appetites in artificial ways, and consequently lead people to eat when not really hungry and drink when not really thirsty. He thought that the best sleep comes after a hard day's work, and he said that the wise man goes to bed not because he's bored, but because he's tired out from work. Socrates' main point is that if we want to live in accord with reason and do what's good for us, sometimes we'll have to be capable of resisting our own desires. Likewise, one of the major findings in modern research on mental health is that people who allow their feelings to dictate their actions too much often suffer as a result. Sometimes we have to be willing to do things in life even though they feel unpleasant, such as facing our fears, if we believe that doing so is in our best interest. Learning to do that, though, can require practice. The last of the four virtues is courage. Socrates was renowned also for his bravery. He fought as an Athenian hoplite or heavy infantryman in at least 3 major battles of the Peloponnesian War. He was still fighting when he was pushing 50 years old, an old man compared to those around him. Socrates appears to have earned a reputation among other soldiers both for his self-discipline and also for his courage. During the Battle of Potidaea, his beloved friend, the young aristocrat Alcibiades, was unhorsed and lay wounded. Socrates saved his life and also salvaged his weapons, something of great importance to the honour of Athenians. In recognition, he was nominated for the military prize of valour, like being awarded a medal, but he declined and insisted that it should be awarded to Alcibiades instead, as he was the officer in command. Years later, during the Athenians' chaotic retreat from the Battle of Delium, they were harassed on all sides by the enemy. Many Athenians were killed. Socrates walked beside the general Laches, who had also lost his horse apparently. Socrates stood beside him on the journey home, protecting him from the enemy. It's said nobody would come near them because Socrates walked along beside Laches, glaring at the enemy so fearlessly. It's no surprise, therefore, that Socrates was held in high regard by other soldiers, and his circle of friends included several Athenian generals. However, arguably the most famous example of Socrates' courage was his behaviour during his trial, facing execution for the charges of impiety and corrupting the youth. Here as elsewhere, Socrates argues that we cannot know for certain whether external events are good or bad, even his own death. However, he does claim to know here that justice is good. He refuses to beg the court for mercy, as was the norm in these situations, or to speak anything but the truth in giving his defence, whether it pleases the jury or not. His argument is very simply that it's not rational to trade what's a certain good for the avoidance of an uncertain evil. He's not willing to do what he considers unethical just to avoid being put to death. This sort of argument crops up repeatedly in the Socratic dialogues in a variety of guises, and it's something that clearly influenced the Stoics. For example, in Book 1 of the Republic, Socrates asks his friend, a venerable old man called Cephalus, what it's like being old. Cephalus says that the other men his age like to complain a lot about their lives, but he's very contented. He observes that things like old age, poor health or poverty can't by themselves make people unhappy, because otherwise everyone would be upset by these things, whereas some people seem indifferent to them. What matters, he says, is how we think about these things and the attitude we have towards them. These sort of arguments are the forerunners of the famous slogan of the Stoic philosopher Epictetus. It's not things that upset us, but our judgments about things. This quote from Epictetus has been taught to hundreds of thousands of clients by cognitive therapists over the last half a century. So that's another important example of the way Socrates, via the Stoics, has influenced the modern psychological techniques used in therapy and self-improvement. So those are your 4 virtues: wisdom, justice, temperance, and courage. That's all I've got time for today. I hope you found it interesting. Please get in touch if you've got any questions about this or about my books or courses. Visit my website, learn.donaldrobertson.name, for more information, and please check out the link to my new course, which I'll post alongside the video, How to Live Like Socrates, where you can learn a lot more about his life and philosophy and how these ideas can be of practical value in modern day life. So until we meet again, it's goodbye from me here in Nova Scotia. Goodbye, everybody.